It seems to be working. There we go. Good. So before we dive into our Torah study for today, let's join together in this blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah la'asok b'divrei Torah hafokba la'asok b'divrei Torah yadadai dai 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 yadadai dai 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 yadadai dai 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 yadadai dai dai dai. So it's so good to be with all of you as we kind of dive into Torah study for this week. I brought out a small section from this Torah portion, which is Behaalotecha, where we talk about a couple of really interesting prophets, Eldad and Medad. What? There's some background noise, something going on. But we're going to be talking about Eldad and Medad, also two great names. And I'm just going to get us going. I'm going to share our text in 1 second. All righty. All right. So what do you know, if anything, about Eldad and Medad? Anyone? Okay, well then guess what? We get to dive into Eldad and Medad this week. I hadn't heard of them until just a handful of years ago. And they're two really interesting prophets that pop up right in the middle of Behaalotecha, and that's what we're going to jump into. So would anyone like to read just these first verses of Torah that will set us up?
Today. I feel like reading today.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Numbers 11, 14 to 17. I cannot carry all this people by myself, for it is too much for me. If you would deal thus with me, kill me rather, I beg you, and let me see no more of my wretchedness. Then the Lord said to Moses, gather for me 70 of Israel's elders, of whom you have experience as elders and officers of the people, and bring them to the tent of meeting and let them take their place there with you. I will come down and speak with you there, and I will draw upon the spirit that is on you and put it upon them. They shall share the burden of the people with you, and you shall not bear it alone.
Yes, thank you so much, Bonnie. And I know I didn't even realize until you started reading. This starts with a bang, doesn't it? Right? I can't bear these people. They're driving me crazy, right? And the context of this whole thing is that Moses is, of course, leading the people Israel, and they are kvetching. They're kvetching because they want their meat, and they're tired of this manna stuff. And they want all this stuff from Moses. And Moses is just like, I can't take it anymore. What do you want from me? I'm doing the best I can over here. You have your needs met. Stop it. And we can kind of feel that angst right here. But Moses is just saying, there's too much pressure on me. I can't do it. And so the earlier advice, if we remember back to Yitro, right, in the earlier portions, all the way back in the book of Exodus, when Yitro, Moses' father-in-law, says, don't try to take it on all yourself, right? Delegate, find other people who can serve as judges under you so that there can be more to go around. Well, this is a similar kind of theme going on here, that get these 70 elders, get this little Sanhedrin group together, right? So that they can help with leading, and they can also help with prophesying. And so that's kind of the setup here. I took a little bit of text about the Israelites complaining out from the middle of this. And then I want us to continue with these verses. Does anyone want to read these?
I'll read.
Thank you.
Moses went out and reported the words of the Lord to the people. He gathered 70 of the people's elders and stationed them around the tent. Then the Lord came down in a cloud and spoke to him. He drew upon the spirit that was on him and put it upon the 70 elders. And when the spirit rested upon them, they spoke in ecstasy, but did not continue. 2 men, one named Eldad and the other Medad, had remained in camp, yet the spirit rested upon them. They were among those recorded, but they had not gone out to the tent, and they spoke in ecstasy in the camp. A youth ran out and told Moses, saying, Eldad and Medad are acting the prophet in the camp. And Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' attendant from his youth, spoke up and said, My lord Moses, restrain them. But Moses said to him, Are you wrought up upon my account? With that all the Lord's people were prophets, and the Lord put his spirit upon them? Moses then re-entered the camp together with the elders of Israel.
Okay, so there's a lot here, but what do you make out of this section? Thank you so much, Barbara, for reading.
Well, I'm not sure about Eldad and Medad myself. Are they taking on responsibility or not?
It is a little confusing what's going on here, and we're going to see there's a lot of commentary that tries to speak to it. In essence, there are going to be these 70 elders who are called to prophesy, and Eldad and Medad are not part of the 70, and yet they are prophesying in the camp. Okay. So there could be a lot of questions coming out of here, like, who are these Eldad and Medad people? Like, why are they prophesying in the camp? Like, what other questions might we have looking at this text?
I was thinking for me, it's a very positive bit of thoughtfulness here. How fortunate for people that there's more than one person who prophesizes, who speaks, who shares his or her, well, there probably weren't too many hers, his thoughts about what's going on. I'm not talking about groupthink as much as I'm talking about God investing in Moses and God and Moses investing in the people. It's pretty nice when you are able to acknowledge people for their ideas, that their sharing of their ideas, the feeling of being safe is important. If you have 2 outliers, if Eldad and Medad are outliers at this point, I'm not sure that's the right word, it's good that it's acknowledged, and then check it out. See where these folks are. Their opinions matter too. We say that all the time in our board of directors meetings, right? Opinions matter.
Yeah, and
they help us.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Marla, for bringing all of this in, because I think what you're responding to is the last part of this, right? Where there's this little bit of a back and forth that's going on with Joshua ben Nun, where Joshua is saying, restrain them. Why are they speaking up? Why are they prophesying? And Moses says, no, let them prophesy. Would that there be even more prophets? It's a good thing. And that's really an interesting back and forth. And the rabbis have a whole lot to say about what really is going on there, where Joshua is coming from, where Moses is coming from, and so on. Any other questions or thoughts on this before we dive into the commentary?
Yeah, I hear flashes of, like, when each morning, like when God restores our soul to us and our breath, it's like a part of that spirit. And the spirit, he put the spirit into the set upon the 70 elders. And it's like, is that something that's happening to us all the time, that we're constantly replenished with the Spirit of God?
That's beautiful.
I don't know. I just made that up.
Yeah, it's beautiful though.
Okay.
So I'm drawn to the, in verse 29, Moses saying, would that all the Lord's people were prophets, that the Lord put his spirit upon them. It's kind of an extension of what Bonnie was bringing up also, which is, this is a process of sharing leadership and sharing also the faith in God and be talking about that. It's like Moses sees this as a plus, not a minus. And would that there be more people that would take this point of view of God, that would listen, that would do that needs to be done, and don't need to be told that this is a good thing to talk about and to rejoice in. And I think that the elders and Joshua, who's being groomed to take over when Moses eventually dies, and Moses, this is like that sharing of responsibility, which is, rank hath its privilege and rank hath its responsibilities. And my father used to say that. And that they could be seen as a threat, because you up here on the mountain with God don't know what they down there are saying, except they're saying something. And the last time something like that happened, we had this golden calf, which was not such a good deal. And so I think Moses is saying help, and God is providing help. Part of it seen, and then part of it then seeming to arise spontaneously within a much larger group of people represented by Eldad and Medad.
Yeah. I think there's a lot to be said for that. And a lot of what you're talking about, Rabbi Catherine, is actually going to come up in some of the later commentaries that we're going to. So we'll be able to delve into that even deeper. Any comments or reflections based on all of that?
Is this something akin to what Christians do when they stand up and they call it testifying in church? They're taking on the role of spreading the word, or what's their experience and what they're feeling and what may be coming up.
I can't speak to that, right? Because I don't know a whole lot about that and its origins. All I can do is talk to this idea of these specific people who are called as prophets and as leaders for the community taking on this responsibility. There's no indication here that it extends beyond that in this particular case, but that doesn't mean it couldn't have other implications, as a few people have said.
I've never, except for rabbis or teachers, I've never run into anybody who would be classified in that category. Not been in that situation.
Mm-hmm.
I have a curious question, because I think I recall that there are 70 names for God. If that's correct, then I'm wondering what the connection is here with the 70 elders that are selected.
Yeah, it's like the 70 faces of God. There's
Right,
actually more than 70 names of God. If you really go through all of it, there's substantially more. I have a list of 70 and is definitely not inclusive of everything. But that's a really interesting idea, because if we were to expand upon that teaching, Sandy, what it says is that every single one of the 70 has a different connection and face with God, and how true that is, right? And that every single one of them, they might be different, but they are no less important, significant, holy. There's a beauty in that.
Is that called Shemot? I'm not sure what that word means. Is it 70 Shemot, or is that?
Shemot is names.
Okay, so I was piggybacking on what Sandy was saying. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, why don't we dive into a few of these texts, because I'll give a little bit of context. And usually I narrow down these texts and take little snippets out of them, because of the sheer volume and needs within our community. I did not have time to do any of that. So I apologize that a lot of these texts are much longer than they would normally be, but we'll go through what we can go through, and that will be great. So Sanhedrin 17a actually has a lot of texts that refer back to Eldad and Medad and what's going on here. I'm just going to take us through this as quickly and straightforward as I can, because I know it is a lot. Apropos the appointment of the elders of Moses, the Gemara or the Talmud discusses additional aspects of the event, right? So the Torah is giving us a little piece, but there's so many questions like, who is Eldad and Medad? How do they even factor into this? Like, we just don't know what the context even is. So Sanhedrin, the rabbis are trying to give us that context. Okay, so they say there were 72 candidates to become elders, but only 70 were needed. So what does that mean? They were chosen by lots with their names put into a box. I'm going to back us up even more. Why are there 72 candidates? Well, there's 12 tribes in Israel. And if you're doing it by 12 tribes, 70 is not divisible by 12. We know that, right? But 72 is. And so if you took 6 from each tribe, that comes up to 72. So there were 72 potential candidates. So what did they have to do in order to narrow it down to 70? Well, this says they were chosen by lots and they put their name into a box. The sages taught, the verse states, and there remained 2 men in the camp. That's where that's coming from. The name of one was Eldad, the name of the other was Medad, and the Spirit rested upon them, and they were among those who were written, but did not go out to the tent, and they prophesied in the camp. Is there a question or something? I thought I heard someone.
Yeah, that just answered my question. I was thinking, well, doesn't it say they were chosen? What does that mean? Well, there it is.
Exactly, because it is. It's really confusing the way that it appears in the Torah. We need some explanation. So if we go on just a little bit more, where did they remain? Some say this means their names remained excluded from those selected from the lots in the box. The Baraita, or the commentary on all of this, explains, at the time that the Holy One, blessed be God, said to Moses, gather for me 70 men of the elders of Israel, Moses said, how shall I do it? If I select 6 from each and every tribe, there will be a total of 72, which will be 2 extra. But if I select 5 from each tribe, there will be a total of 60, lacking 10. And if I select 6 from this tribe and 5 from this tribe, I will bring about envy between the tribes, as those with fewer representatives will resent the others. So what did he do? He selected 6 from every tribe, brought 72 slips, and on 70 of them he wrote elder, and he left 2 of them blank. He mixed them and placed them in a box. He then said to the 72 chosen candidates, come, draw your slips. Everyone whose hand drew up a slip that said elder, he said to him, heaven has already sanctified you. And everyone whose hand drew up a blank slip, he said to him, the omnipresent does not desire you. What can I do for you? That's gotta hurt, right?
Wow. That is quite an explanation.
Take a hike.
You gotta love it.
Wow.
Poor Eldad and Medad. They got the short end of the straw.
Yep. Oh.
But it was by chance. I mean,
But as Rabbi Leib taught, right? There's no such thing as a coincidence.
oh, okay.
It's God being anonymous, right? And that seems to be the idea of what's going on here. God is actually choosing. It's not Moses, because if Moses is the one to choose, he's going to have to deal with a whole lot. That's not going to help him out, right? Remember, this whole thing started because Moses was frustrated because he couldn't deal with the complaints of the people all the time. The last thing he wanted was to deal with the envy and everything going on between the tribes. But here, if it's based on slips of paper randomly or with the help of God, well, it's hard to get angry at Moses because Moses is not the one who did it.
It's literally the luck of the draw.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. Now, this last says, then somebody, one of the, have to be either Eldad or Medad, says to him must be Moses. So God doesn't desire you. What can I do for you? That is a really interesting statement.
Yeah. I mean, those words are pretty harsh right there. The omnipresent does not desire you. It's like knife to the heart. And that's pretty rough.
And Moses offer, I mean, that's some, God doesn't desire you. So what can I, Moses, do for you?
Participants, 14.
Yeah. So there's a kind of kindness that's coming from Moses here, right? Moses doesn't need to say, what can I do for you? But Moses, he has to realize that there's a sting here. This hurts. I mean, these two people were chosen and yet turned away at the door.
I would say, but at least they got their names in the Torah. The other 70 did not.
And that is a really important point, Larry, that will come up later as well, right? We don't know who the other 70 were.
Right.
There's no mention of their names in the Torah. And yet we know, or at least we know now, Eldad and Medad.
Right.
And so we might question as to why that is. And there's going to be a bunch of midrashim that talk about why it is that we need to know Eldad and Medad's names specifically. Anything else before I kind of move us forward to the next text?
Well, you wonder what they're going to do. They're not unchosen. They just don't get to go to the meeting, but they're the first to prophesy. To prophesize. Yeah.
And so we might think for a second, what does that mean, right? Like if the people know that there are 70 people to be chosen for this, and that Eldad and Medad are not among those 70, and all of a sudden they start prophesying, what's the response to Eldad and Medad?
Well, what we read is people say, how can they do that? It's us guys at the meeting who are supposed to be able to do that. And they, sorry, but they're not here. It's like that strike. This is a very delicate group of people anyway. And to exert that kind of leadership when it hasn't been specifically and publicly justified by Moses speaking for God. This doesn't say that God spoke directly to Eldad and Medad. It says, prophecy is speaking the word of God, though. It's a really kind of fun place to be in. And Moses proves it. I wish everybody else was doing that. Basically.
And that's right. And that's why, this really is such a progressive text in so many ways, right? Because it's setting up a system and then it is knocking it down in the same breath. Okay, Steve, I hear you. If you want to put anything in the chat, I'll make sure it's read aloud, okay? All right, why don't we go a little bit further in, because there's going to be a lot more commentary speaking to all of this. So this is a commentary from Or HaChaim based on this verse, where it says, he took from the Spirit of God. This word may have been intended as a clue to the source of this prophetic spirit, i.e. the Olam ha'atzilut, a domain very close to the throne of God, from the spirit which was upon him. This may describe the quality of that spirit. The source of the spirit which was bestowed on the elders emanated not from Moses, but from higher regions. Alternatively, it may mean that after the spirit which imbued Moses was given to the elders, Moses' own spirit remained fully intact. Bamidbar 15 states that when Moses evaluated the level of prophecy the elders attained, it turned out that the two elders, Eldad and Medad, had received a higher degree of prophetic spirit because their portion came from God directly, whereas the other 70 elders received their prophetic spirit only from Moses. This was why the 70 elders prophesied only briefly.
I thought the cloud came down with the Spirit of God over the whole group, including Eldad and Medad.
Yes, there is definitely a cloud that comes down. I mean, in this text, let's go up just
In the very beginning, we read that, yeah.
right. But the cloud spoke to Moses, right? And there's a lot of places throughout the book of Numbers where there's a cloud. It appears multiple times throughout this particular week's Torah portion. But usually it's spoken about as God being present within the midst of everyone. In this case, when we're talking about the spirit landing upon them, we're talking about this prophetic spirit, which is not something that, according to the book of Numbers, lands upon every individual. It's only those who God gives this extra special gift to. What do you make of Orach Chaim's kind of idea here that Eldad and Medad are actually given the highest prophetic spirit, even more than the 70 others who were chosen? The irony that I find here, right, is that the 70 elders are chosen. They're probably nervous when they're picking these little slips out, if we go by that midrash, right? That they're nervous. Maybe my name won't be chosen. I want to be in this group of people. And Eldad and Medad might be totally distraught that they were left out of this group. Maybe one way of looking at it, right? And as is so often the case in life, or is sometimes the case in life, Eldad and Medad thought that they had the worst end of the deal. But it turned out that being left out was actually the greatest blessing they could ever have imagined. Like, how many times in life does something happen and we say, oh, this is the worst thing ever. I don't know how I'm going to get through this. And then because that thing happened, we find great blessings we never would have had and never even could have imagined if that thing hadn't happened.
Been there, done that.
Yeah, I think it's true for many of us.
Mhm.
Everyone is so quiet today.
Actually, I had just thought about something in connection with what you mentioned.
Yeah.
Yesterday, I was reading some material about the 9/11 attack. This is the 20th year that since that's happened. And the book I was reading actually went through and followed what happened on each airplane as it happened. And what it struck me was, what about somebody who just missed the plane? And they would have thought, oh, I missed the plane. It's terrible. And afterwards, my God, you're glad you missed it.
That's a good point.
Yeah, you just don't know, right? In life, sometimes you just don't know which way things are going to go. But here, Eldad and Medad, look at this blessing that they received. Thanks.
I kind of want to know what they said. But that is not recorded.
There's some midrashim that will offer suggestions there, but they're midrashim only.
Right.
Marla, were you raising your hand? Did you want to say something? Oh, okay. Sorry. I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
I have an experience when I was in the military. it actually happened. Person had an option to fly in one airplane or another, and they flipped a coin, and one airplane, one went to the other. One airplane didn't make it, and 17 people died. And when he got back, and of course he survived, I don't know in detail, but it really impacted his life severely.
Wow.
He took to drink, and he eventually became pretty much disabled over it.
Oh, that's awful. What a terrible, terrible story for everyone involved. So I'm going to take us to this text and take us just back to this idea of Eldad and Medad being left out. That Rashi is bringing in a text from another commentary, Sifrei Bamidbar, saying, but there remained two in the camp, two of them that had been selected. They remained in the camp because they said, we are not worthy of this distinction. So this is a totally different idea of looking at how this transpired, right? The Torah doesn't say how there came to be 70 instead of 72. One midrash said it's because there were all these notes given out, and two were told, okay, God doesn't want you for this. But this commentary says something entirely different. 72 people were chosen, and Eldad and Medad said, no, the two of us, we're going to step out. We're humble. We want to step out. We don't think we're worthy of this place, so that there could be 70 to go. It really is a different way of looking at it, isn't it?
It would suggest that they are humble. Because remember what said about Moses at the very end of his life, at the very end of, that he was a humble man. And that we see a lot of evidence that he wasn't so humble. So maybe it's pulling on that type of a thing, that there are people that are saying, okay,
Yeah. But if we think of them in this light, right, of saying, we're not worthy of this distinction, then what does that do when they then start prophesying in the camp? What does that say about that prophecy and why it is that they're prophesying?
Doesn't it denigrate it?
Does it?
Well, I don't know.
We'll say more about that.
Yeah. It says we are not worthy of this distinction. So anything that they maybe there is a thought that what they if they're speaking in ecstasy or whatever, that maybe it really isn't from the word of God. I really,
maybe God was looking for that quality of humility.
Could be.
But here's the beauty of it, right? There's so many ways to look at it. Does it mean their prophecy is less authentic, or does it mean that it's more authentic, or does it mean that it's equally authentic?
Who knows?
Exactly. There's a couple more texts that speak to this that I'm just going to bring in really, really quickly, which is Behor Shor says, we are not worthy. If we withdraw, there will be no need to draw lots, and no one will be embarrassed by picking a blank slip. So they're about to. He set up this whole process, right? But then the two of them jump out and say, nope, we don't want there to be any harm. We don't want there to be any envy. We don't want anyone to argue. We're just going to step out so that people can do this in peace. We don't need to be included. It's okay. Our egos are good. Which is another way of looking at it. So the original 70 did not continue to prophecy, but as a reward for their modesty, Eldad and Medad did continue. Their gift was a lifelong gift, whereas the 70 elders, it wasn't the case. And Abarbanel similarly writes, 2 real men distinguished for their modesty. This is why their names are given. And this goes back to what you were saying, Larry. For only the most distinguished, whether by good qualities or bad, had their names recorded in the Bible so that they could always be remembered. Their humility is why they were given this honor. Oh, this is a very long text. All right, I will just get us through this fairly quickly. I'll skip over the parts we don't need to do. Sorry, I must have hit something without realizing. So this is Numbers Rabbah. Another interpretation, gather me 70 men from the elders of Israel. When the Holy One, blessed be he, said to Moses, gather me 70 men, Moses said, how will I manage to get them? So this is similar. We've already heard this piece about the papers. There is some redundancy within these texts sometimes. Okay. So the wording here is a little harsh as well. The officer in charge would say to him, look, here is another paper with elder written upon it. If you had been worthy of being appointed, a paper with elder would have come up in your hand. When Moses had followed this procedure, the elders were appointed, and Eldad and Medad were there, but they excluded themselves. They said, we are not worthy to be in the number of elders. Now, because they excluded themselves, they were found to have become superior to the elders in 5 respects. The elders only prophesied for the morrow, as stated, and you shall say to the people, purify yourselves for the morrow. But these men prophesied what was going to happen at the end of 40 years, as stated in Numbers, but 2 men had remained in the camp. The name of one was Eldad, the name of the other was Medad, and they were prophesying in the camp. But what were they prophesying? Some say they were prophesying about the downfall of Gog, while others say they were prophesying that Moses would die and that Joshua would bring Israel into the land. You yourself know that they prophesied, since it was what Joshua told Moses. Then Joshua ben Nun, Moses' attendant, from his youth answered, and it is written, but a lad ran and told Moses. Who was it? It was Moses' son, Gershom. The elders did not enter the land, but these did enter the land. Eldad is listed in Numbers, and Medad is as well, and it gives different names. The elders were not designated by their names, but these were designated by their names because the elders had the prophecy cease. We've already heard this. I will set aside some of the spirit which is upon you and put it on them. But these 2 had their prophesy which come from God, God's self. Now, if you say, since the elders had their prophecy from what belonged to Moses, might it have lessened his prophecy somewhat? And the answer was no. So Moses remained the prophet who he was. So also in the case of Moses, although the prophets took of his prophecy, the prophecy of Moses was in no way diminished, because it said, never again did there arise in Israel a prophet quite like Moses. But if we go back earlier in this section, this idea that the prophecy that Eldad and Medad were giving in the camp was that Moses would die brings another kind of perspective and another layer to what's going on here, because Joshua is responding to the fact that these 2 men are prophesying in the camp when they weren't the 70 elders. And so why do you think Joshua would have that reaction, right? Joshua was responding not just to the fact that these 2 prophets are prophesying when they weren't part of the 70, but in addition, he's responding to the fact that the prophecy is about Moses, his mentor, the leader of the Jewish people, dying.
Well, since people have many times argued back and revolted and been revolting and all of that, And it's still kind of tentative. You know, we're spending 40 years in the desert here, you know, and for people to think that Moses, who they are finally accepting as a leader after many, many incidents which keep going on, and it's like, who's going to be there then? I mean, this Joshua guy who we don't know very well, who's just been tagging along, I could see where they would think it would completely destabilize the whole place.
Right. It could be easy to look at Eldad and Medad and say, these two guys aren't even supposed to be prophets. Now they're coming and they're causing all this trouble. Like, we need to restrain them. Or as this commentary says, Rabbi Cassi, a little bit later, he says, my Lord Moses, lock them up. That's the translation that he uses here. And goes on, the reason that Joshua said this was because Eldad and Medad had prophesied that Moses would die in the desert and Joshua would lead the people into the land of Canaan. So Joshua is saying, who, me? Like, I'm going to be able to lead the people? Moses is going to die? Yeah. Nachmanides feels that the reason Joshua wanted these men locked up was because they had refused Moses's instructions to present themselves as the tabernacle together with the other 70 men. So there's a different interpretation. They didn't show up. They didn't show up. Totally different, right? They're breaking the rules. They had failed to obey an order. He considered it possible that what they prophesied was a lie and that they were irrational and had to be put under guard. So we can sense all of this angst that's going on here. We can put ourselves in the position of the average Israelite who doesn't know exactly what's going on, in the position of Joshua. And depending on how we read this, depending on how we understand how Eldad and Medad came to not be included in the 72 or in the 70, that can totally change the way we look at this entire text. And it's also important to just note that this is a text that is very much pushing against the status quo. We have 70 elders. They're chosen by God to be the 70 elders. They are the people who are supposed to prophesy with Moses. Moses himself is putting some of his prophecy kind of power onto these 70, right? And then these two guys start prophesying in the camp. They weren't the ones who were with Moses. They didn't get this. Why do they have any right to be saying anything? So there's this desire to put things into categories. The 70 are the ones we listen to. These two are not it. Don't want to hear anything you have to say. There must be something wrong with you, or you must be trying to stir up trouble. But Moses doesn't come at it from that perspective at all. Moses is entirely different in his view of this. And in a typical display of humility, Rabbi Cassi says, he said that he wished God would bestow prophetic spirit on the entire nation directly, not merely using him as an intermediary. Moses is saying, I don't need to be in the middle of this. God chose these two men to get prophecy from God. All the power to them. I wish there were more. If that isn't leadership, I don't know what is, right? Another nuance, he says, and the exclamation by Joshua, lock them up, is that it was against accepted practice to prophecy in the presence of Moses. It had become an accepted norm that no prophet would prophesy about something in the future when there were prophets of greater stature alive among the people. The minor prophets would deport themselves as disciples of the leading prophet of the generation. But were the people often referred to in the book of Kings as the sons of the prophets. Talmud Sanhedrin also says that according to the opinion that these two men prophesied that Moses would die and that Joshua would lead the people to the Holy Land, we can understand why Joshua felt compelled to call for the incarceration of these two men. I included a lot of text here.
Yeah.
I'm going to actually skip over this next text here and just go to this Rashi, where Moses is quoted as saying, like, are you being zealots for me? Like, is the reason that you are so angry that these two men are prophesying because you think that this in some way threatens me as a leader or threatens the status quo of leadership? This Hebrew word, zealous, can mean both jealous and zealous. It refers to one who takes something to heart and acts with great fervor, someone who takes the brunt of the load. So perhaps his disciples, like Joshua, are feeling a little protective of Moses and of the status quo. And that's the reason that they are apt to respond very quickly to want to kind of shut down the prophecy of Eldad and Medad. And it's an understandable perspective.
Mhm.
So I just want to check in with all of you. What are you kind of taking out of this whole kind of situation in all of these texts?
This is the first time for me that when I'm learning about the Midrashim, I'm losing the authorship of that. And I'm thinking that these various responses are really a reflection of what people feel, that all of this could be true. And that's probably what happens, that people who are both in a leadership position and people who are not in a leadership position all have opinions. They all have opinions as to why this person is leading in this way, or in this case, prophesizing. I feel like I'm part of what these writers are saying about me. It's a different feeling I have this week.
Yeah, I think that's so true, right? That a lot of times when we look at Torah, because there's so many holes, there's so many questions, there's so many ways to understand what's going on, especially in this text. We're given a few verses and we're trying to understand, what is this all about, right? The only thing that we can do is we can take our own experience and try to, based on the knowledge, based on the wisdom that we accumulate in our lives, based on our imagination as well, we put ourselves into the text to try to understand what's going on in these characters' minds. And so that's why a lot of people say that depth, like study of Torah, is actually also a study of oneself, that we can learn so much about ourselves and about one another by the way in which we see the Torah. And it can change day to day, minute to minute. That's totally fine too, right? Because we're complex. We have a lot of different aspects of ourselves. Michael, did you want to say something?
So I think your question was, what are you getting from all this? And one word came into my mind immediately, and that is confusion. But I apologize for that, but that's just, but I get what you're saying, man. I get the meaning of what you're saying about it.
Right. So part of that confusion is also like part of life, right? There's multiple different realities going on here. We have the small little text of Torah that we're given with Eldad and Medad. And the rabbis are all coming up with different potential scenarios. And we don't know which one is right. So we have to sit with them side by side next to one another and try to make sense of it for ourselves. What do I buy? What don't I buy? Do I think that Eldad and Medad were humble and said, no, other elders, you get to do it. I'll stand back? Do we think that Eldad and Medad were doing that because they wanted to take away the envy and jealousy within the community, or because they didn't believe in themselves? They were down on themselves. Or do we think that Eldad and Medad were not chosen by God for some reason? Do we think, like Joshua is saying here, that Eldad and Medad were actually causing some problems, maybe purposefully causing some problems here. Any of these are potential scenarios based on the text that we read. So the question really comes down to, what do you think is going on? What feels compelling to you? And so now that we're getting everyone anxious by psychoanalyzing our own perspectives on how we see this scenario, I want to invite anyone who is brave enough to share, like, what do you see? Like, we've gone through a few of these different texts. I'm actually not going to bring in any more because I'm afraid it's going to get even more confusing if I do. But what do you make of it? What do you see in this story with Eldad and Medad? Who are they?
I'm not going to answer that question, but I'm going to say that Rabbi Cassi, as our teacher, you always speak to us in ecstasy, and I thank you for that. Yeah, that is meant as a compliment. I hope it came out.
It did. Thank you, Michael.
You're welcome.
Actually, in reference to one thing you mentioned earlier about these two, their names being remembered, your name being remembered seems to me to be an important distinction. And maybe that's one of the many things that people might get out of this. There's some reason that their names are remembered and the names of the others are not.
So why do you think that is? Is it because they're so great that they should be remembered, or because they're so, bad?
Well, that's subject to interpretation.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm asking you. What do you see?
I think it's for the positive reason. There's something in their actions that's commendable. And I think that's the reason that their names are present. And I think in order for us to understand that, we have to, as we've done here in this session, put ourselves in their place, or in the place of people who are judging them, or in Moses' place, and what did he think? And that's where I think, that's what I'm getting out of these Torah sessions, that because of this ambiguity, there are many possibilities. And it is something that makes you think, rather than some plain statement of, this is the way it was and that's it. That the whole story is told.
Mm-hmm.
It isn't. You're part of
it. And I would I agree with Jim, that, if you're looking at Torah for a source of morality and guiding us in our lives, and establishing a just community and society, I would err to the interpretations that support that, which are the more positive, like you mentioned, the leadership and some of those things.
Beautiful. And I see in the chat as well that Marla and Steve are talking about this concept of their humility. The reason that they're given these extra kind of powers as a prophet, because they were able to be humble and kind of take their step back.
There's another potential aspect to this, and that is, as we're doing here, discussing it, at least two people, perhaps more, discussing their own interpretations, you learn something of the other person, where they're coming from, by the way of the interpretation they place on it. To the extent that that's a useful thing, you get to know other people better.
Exactly. Exactly.
But by being unchosen, doesn't it give them the chance, or all of us, the chance to choose the right path in life? I mean, isn't that another way? But you choose it rather than necessarily following a path that's chosen for you.
Oh, so you're bringing another element in here, right?
Yeah.
Because some of the texts do talk about Eldad and Medad saying, no, I'm going to choose not to do this.
Okay.
And is that where you're going to, right? Because this way they can forge their own path.
Yeah. Yes.
So you see strength in them. You see like them kind of taking control and doing what they need to do in order to live their best lives. And I think there's something really beautiful in that interpretation.
Yeah, thank you. one way that I see it.
Rabbi Cassi, you seem deep in thought. Yeah.
I kind of see this year, this is the first time I've been in a group that is actually focused on these two people. I like to think not only of the humility, but of God speaking to them and through them, and that they had the courage and I don't know what words to use. It's like when you're really inspired and you feel that God is talking to you and through you, and that you don't even think about it. You say the words that come to you. So that's kind of how I see them. And then Moses backs their play, as it were. But that to me is secondary to them speaking the words of God as they saw them. We were talking about what is it when somebody raises their hands in a revival service.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I was muted there. At the risk of maybe dragging on just a bit too long on a point that may not be the main point, it strikes me, see, I have a hobby. I build these things here, these little look like old time radios. And when I first did this, I would put music on here. I donate these to retirement homes and convalescent homes. It makes people happier. My father was in one. I think I wish he would have had one of these. It would have made him much more happy than he was. But I got to the point of actually including programs on there, old programs like Fibber McGee and Molly and all that. And it strikes me that may be more useful to people who may be close to losing some of their mentality, because it forces you to imagine, to see something happening rather than a movie where it's presented to you and hitting you in the face. And I think that's similar to this, where it's forcing you to envision things that you might not have otherwise thought of. And it's a deeper way of understanding things than somebody simply telling you outright, this is the way it is. And so there is one point, though, that I've done some reading of Orthodox Judaism, where it seems that some people who are Orthodox say this is the way it is and don't think about it. And I'm curious about that, because it seems that Reform Judaism is more open to this sort of discussion. Not to get into that too much, but it's just an observation that
Yeah.
one book I read, a person was turned off to his very Orthodox father because his father gave him no explanations. He just said, when the fellow would ask a question, why is this? He said, that's just the way it is. Don't ask questions. Well,
right. I think one of the reasons that I think it's important to bring in texts like I did today, even though they are confusing, I totally understand that, to be holding all of these things at one time, is to remind us that that's not what Judaism isn't about. This is how it was. It never has been. These are the rabbis. This is the Talmud. These rabbis are arguing with one another about totally different interpretations, right? And none of them are wrong. Like, everyone is right. They see something within the text. They can't all possibly have happened in the same story, but all of them are right. And what that means is we can have different perspectives on the same text, and there is holiness in them. And the second that we try to be as Joshua was in this text, and we say, no, let's shut them down, they're saying something different than we want them to say, we stop actually truly living our Jewish lives. Moses is the leader here and saying, no, would that there be more prophets? How wonderful it would be if we could have even more interpretations. We need that. Thanks, Steve. So I'm looking at the time, and it is 1:32 already, and I'm sure we could discuss even more here, and I hope that we continue to kind of wrestle with this. But Marla, I'm wondering if you might be able to end us off with some words of blessing.
We can. It's the last verse in the very first section that we read together today. It's Numbers 11, verse 17. Others share the burden with you. You shall not bear it alone. And the blessing is for heavy burdens. Know that others bear the same burdens you do, and find comfort in the shared experience of being human. May you see that your longings and desires are only hindrances on your journey towards light. You are not alone in facing hungers and yearnings that threaten to overtake you. May you face your own shortcomings and raise them up to the light. May you see your heavy burdens as obstacles you can overcome and deal with. May you recognize your own fears, your cravings, and your restlessness, and through awareness and acceptance, diminish their power over your inner peace. May you feel the light of the Holy One raise you up and lighten your burdens. Oh, you're muted.
Yep, I just realized that. Thank you so much, Marla. And thank you all for all of your insights and thought here today. And I'll try to make the Lux Torah study not quite as confusing. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank
Happy
you, Rabbi.
birthday, Irv. I hope you have a great one.
Happy birthday, Irv.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday.